As I witnessed the recent unfolding of tragic events between Israel and Hamas, part of me did not want to touch this subject with a 10-foot pole. It's a topic that can instantly generate intense heat while trying to shed light. Perhaps I'm just another moth drawn to the flame, but curious as I am, I'm trying to understand the conflict and history better. I sense that everyone who is discussing this entire conflict is missing something profoundly important, something that is preventing peace and which, sadly, might do so in perpetuity. So perhaps quixotically, I've decided to make a video about this most controversial of topics. So what is it that is preventing peace between Israel and Palestine, and is there anything the rest of the world can actually do about it? If a video on this most sensitive of topics is to have any chance of shedding light rather than just generating more heat, I need to be completely candid. I'm not going to pretend I am without bias. No human being is. What truly matters is whether the author, however falteringly, is trying to get to some important truths, rather than merely pushing an agenda. Here, as with all of my videos, I'm searching for underlying truths that will help us find ways to solve problems. So, personal disclosure here, on my father's side, I'm partly descended from Eastern European Jews. My great-grandparents and grandfather fled the Holocaust, and members of the extended family live in Israel. I, however, am not religious, and our family hasn't been for the past 2 generations. As a child growing up, I was a member of a Jewish community center and saw the devastation of the Second Intifada. Though my own history allows me to more readily relate to the Israeli side, I know people are from the Arab world, as well as those who are sympathetic towards the Palestinians. Looking at all the evidence, I don't believe either side in the conflict is innocent. Both Jews and Palestinians have committed atrocities. I also don't think trying to determine which side has more right on its side is helpful in trying to find a path to real peace. I also don't believe any human being is inherently bloodthirsty. Here, I'm simply trying to find the essential causes of the conflict and explore the paths to workable solutions. Human conflicts are by their very nature the most intractable topics to research. Different sources, influenced by different sides, often say very different things, even while honestly believing they are engaging in objective reporting or scholarship. As much as possible, I will be focusing on facts and conclusions that are undeniable, or better, undisputed with the evidence confirmed by numerous and neutral sources. If I have missed something, please let me know in the comments. To begin to grapple with why there is no peace between Israel and Palestine, we need to understand the current situation, which, quite frankly, is a mess. The current political status of the Palestinian state is governed by the Oslo Accords, which transfers certain powers, authority, and territorial control to the Palestinian Authority. It was meant to be a transition period before the Palestinian state could be granted full sovereignty in a later peace agreement. Unfortunately, that peace agreement never happened, as subsequent Camp David Accords failed to produce a two-state solution. The turmoil in the aftermath of the collapse of these talks led to the Second Intifada, which saw hundreds of Israeli civilians killed in suicide bombings and thousands of Palestinians killed by Israeli soldiers. The state of Palestine has been caught in this political limbo ever since. To make things worse, there isn't just one Palestinian government. The 2006 elections led to Hamas seizing power and a conflict between Fatah and Hamas rule. Today, Fatah controls the West Bank and Hamas the Gaza Strip. There haven't been parliamentary elections since then, meaning Palestine has essentially been ruled by presidential decree for over a decade without political representation. Beyond the WION, the current unrest and unclear political situation comes at a huge economic cost. Before the conflict, Palestine was one of the fastest growing economic regions in the world. It has stagnated ever since. Economic opportunity for Palestinians has been severely limited due to restricted mobility as well as poor service delivery and corruption resulting from the chaotic political situation. As part of the Oslo Accords, Palestinians must cross several security checkpoints, even just to visit other Palestinian villages. In response to the bombing attacks of the Second Intifada, Israel erected a security barrier in the West Bank, further restricting mobility. The lack of an elected government means it's hard for Palestinians to hold their leaders accountable, meaning they often aren't. These unelected leaders can and do embezzle vast sums of money to serve their own interests and not their people's. Despite the serious human and economic toll, why does the conflict still persist? Why are both parties unable to come to an agreement? To get a better sense of what is really going on, I sought to learn from the videos created by the Ask Project, which is led by Corey Giles-Schuster, where he interviews both Israelis and Palestinians and asks them probing questions. After watching over a half a dozen videos of Palestinians being asked about their thoughts on peace, a troubling realization emerges. Here is the inconvenient truth many people who want peace are not acknowledging. Most Palestinians don't actually want peace. When Palestinians decry the occupation, their target is not what you might think. They are not talking about the current occupation of Israeli soldiers and settlers in the West Bank or East Jerusalem. Rather, they are talking about the occupation by Israelis of all of Israel. They believe that all of the territory of today's Israel is rightfully theirs, and Zionists invaded and took their country. A portion of these people further believe that any means for taking back their country is justified, including violence against women and children. The views shown in these videos are supported by polling data showing that 2/3 of Palestinians support regaining all of historic Palestine for Palestinians. Sadly, this attitude appears even more prevalent among young people. It's clear that these widely held beliefs make peace impossible. Any government official who sticks out their neck for peace risks vehement disapproval or worse, assassination. Moreover, this makes the other party to any negotiation extremely wary about conceding anything, no matter how reasonable the matter might outwardly appear. It becomes far too easy to reasonably view any attempt by Palestinian officials to negotiate peace as merely a ploy, as part of their plan to eventually invade and drive you into the sea. In this context, it doesn't matter where you draw the lines or how many states are in your solution. No peace plan can possibly work. Well, you might be wondering, how do Israelis feel about peace? Most, though not all, when asked the same question as posed to Palestinians, appeared quite willing to compromise if it meant gaining a true and lasting peace. There is, however, growing cynicism over whether peace is even possible. Now, I should be clear that there are some Palestinians who do want peace and are genuinely ready to compromise. There are also many who condemn violence universally. Unfortunately, these people are in the minority, and many of them, fearing violence, are afraid to share their views. Before we can have any discussion about what is to be done, we need to first verify, is there a legitimate grievance here? Do the facts support the Palestinian narrative that Jews invaded their country and stole their land? Remember, when they refer to country, they are not referring to the West Bank and Gaza, they are referring to all of the territory of the State of Israel. Let me list what I believe are well-established facts and historical events and let you decide for yourself. The term Palestinian is said to be derived from the Philistines, the group of people Goliath from the Bible supposedly belonged to. However, modern Palestinians have completely different origins than those of the ancient Philistines. Modern-day Palestinians trace their roots to the Arab invasions in the 7th century CE. However, there is some genetic evidence that both modern Jews and Palestinians can trace their lineage to the Canaanites. More research needs to be done to confirm this. The term Palestine was coined by the Romans when they named a province in the region Syria Palestina after subduing the local Jewish population. The lands that we call Israel and Palestine were conquered and controlled by various empires such as the Byzantines, Umayyads, Crusaders, and Ottomans. The population of the region in 1850, which was then a minor province of the Ottoman Empire, was about 300,000, far lower than the estimated population in antiquity. The population at the time was almost completely Arab with a tiny Jewish minority. In the following decades, the population would more than double to over 700,000 in 1915. After the Ottoman Empire collapsed in the aftermath of World War I, the League of Nations conferred these territories to the British Empire, under what became known as the British Mandate of Palestine. In 1917, while still at war with the Ottomans, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, signaling support for the establishment of a home for Jews in the territory. The number of Jews rapidly rose as many fled anti-Semitism and later Nazi persecution. They purchased land from Arab landowners to build their new settlements. To deal with rising nationalism and violence between Arabs and Jews, the UN approved a partition plan in 1947 that would establish Jewish and Arab states. The population at this time was around 1.9 million, 68% Muslim, 32% Jewish. Surrounding Arab nations did not agree with the partition plan and started to mobilize for war. What followed was a series of escalating violence and atrocities that culminated in the declaration of the State of Israel and the outbreak of all-out war. Fearing violence, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled their homes, with some forced out by Jews in what would be known as the Nakba. Given the historical facts, I think it's fair to say many individual Palestinians did lose their homes and some of them indeed had their land taken by Jews. I also believe it's fair to describe Israel's current presence in the West Bank as an occupation, as that was territory legally designated for Arabs by the UN. However, the narrative that Jews invaded their country is not supported by the facts because until 1948, there was no country. Up until the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, all of the property Jews owned had been legitimately bought, and the property that was taken after that was largely the result of people fleeing the conflict, one that started when Arab nations rejected the 1947 partition plan. Whether you think the existence of Israel is a good thing is irrelevant. The fact is, the law says Israel, as well as a separate Arab state, has a legal right to exist. If this is the case, why do most Palestinians believe in a narrative that doesn't accord with what actually happened, a narrative which is now seriously damaging their own lives? As with many grievances that derive from a selective view of history, these beliefs have been sustained and even amplified by decades of indoctrination through the education system and through state media. Since the Oslo Accords, the Palestinian Authority has controlled how Palestinians are taught. Even the most moderate assessments show that Palestinians are not being taught peace, as virtually all school textbooks portray Israel as the enemy and fail to show it on a map. Disturbingly, the latest textbooks are even more extreme, using counting martyrs to teach math and celebrating people who murdered Israeli civilians as heroes. Most countries and involved UN agencies have largely turned a blind eye to this issue as their foreign aid continues to be used to support this hate. In the past, Palestinian state TV has broadcast programs like Tomorrow's Pioneers, which encouraged young children to murder Jews and martyr themselves. Actions by the Palestinian Authority are perpetuating the conflict, and in a cynically logically way, it makes sense for them to do so. They are, after all, the ones that benefit the most. These Palestinian elites foment hatred in their own people towards Israel and distract the public from their own corruption. This hatred naturally causes conflict with Israel. The world community, responding to humanitarian crises arising from these conflicts, becomes compelled to help the Palestinians. Not only does this give the elites aid funding which they can funnel into their own pockets, it also puts these elites in the spotlight from where they can gather the world's praise. Now, there are some officials in the Palestinian government who do genuinely want the best for their people and have indeed done good work. However, they are in the minority. The lack of public accountability also means any progress made is easily reversed. In examining the conflict between Israel and Palestine, we can see there are two cycles perpetuating the conflict. The one where fear and hatred feed off each other, leading to more extreme responses from both sides, and the cycle for corrupt Palestinian officials to perpetuate the conflict for their own personal benefit. If we're to find a path to peace for the region, we will need to break and reverse these cycles. Reversing the indoctrination will be exceedingly difficult and will likely take a generation. It would also be without historical precedent. Yes, there are examples where people and nations have abandoned hateful ideologies. Think of denazification and Japan's post-war rebuilding. But remember, these both came after the bloodiest conflict in world history. So far, I've been unable to find an example of this happening where bloodshed has been avoided. I think the first action needed to reverse the indoctrination and bring peace is to take away the control of education from the Palestinian Authority and make the curriculum teach critical thinking, peace, and tolerance. Education could be handled by an agency overseen by countries both the Palestinian Authority and Israel can agree to. Secondly, more connections need to be built between Palestinian and Israeli civilians. People are much less likely to be interested in killing and hurting people they have a personal connection with. I noticed in the videos from the Ask Project that, on both sides, those who had better opinions of the other side were those who interacted more with them. There are many charities who are doing great work to build connections between Israelis and Palestinians. Unfortunately, their influence, especially on Palestinians, is still quite small. For these activities to make the societal shift we need, the scope needs to be increased significantly. Israel already has compulsory military service. Why not have compulsory peace building? International agencies could give Palestinians financial incentives to participate in such activities as well. Finally, Palestinians need a vision for what their own prosperous state could look like. Right now, all they have is one of conquering everything for themselves. If Palestinians are living better lives and have the opportunity to do so, they could well become less interested in waging war. Creating a prosperous Palestinian state will involve building robust institutions and cooperating with neighbors. Unfortunately, the current government of Palestine, as we have mentioned earlier, has little incentive to do so as they benefit from the current conflict. However, the sway of the Palestinian Authority need not be an insuperable barrier. A possible and creative workaround is charter cities, an idea proposed by Paul Romer in which a city-state is established within a country's borders, but is run by liberal institutions in accord with proven traditions of common law that respect property and individual rights. The idea is to create a pre-2020 Hong Kong or Singapore that can serve as an example for the rest of the country. For instance, in the case of Palestine, a charter city could be established in Area C lands. If Palestinians like the new vision presented by the charter city, they could vote with their feet by moving there. If the city starts to grow and prosper, Palestinians in other parts of the territory would likely feel strongly induced to adopt those customs and institutions. If you would like to see a video that further elucidates this idea, please let me know in the comments below. After watching the videos interviewing Palestinians about their views on peace, my heart sank, as it seemed the conflict might continue in perpetuity or come to a bloody end. At the same time, in those videos, I saw glimmers of hope. There were people on both sides who accepted each other and were willing to compromise and move on. To borrow from one of my favorite shows, Naruto, what's more important than knowing a way to achieve peace is the power to believe in it. I believe peace can happen between Israel and Palestine. However, it will take a concerted effort that is unprecedented in history, and it will likely take a generation. At the end of the day, peace can only happen if Israelis treat forging a peace as seriously as protecting their country, and if Palestinians abandon the fantasy of ruling everything and instead embrace a new vision of building a prosperous and peaceful Palestinian state. For this video, I would like to give a shout out to the Ask Project. Their videos of interviews with Palestinians and Israelis are enlightening. They help me understand the problem at a deeper level. Please consider supporting them.